Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. As you saw, I once had dark hair when I lived in California. Banking can be an onerous profession. Thank you for those kind words, Bill. My father would have been amazed, but I suspect my mother might even have believed one or two of your words. Also, I thank the Foreign Policy Association for this great honor. I do not deserve it. As Bill has said, I'm the leader of a team, but I'm surrounded by wonderful colleagues worldwide, and I accept it in due course on behalf of them, because it's their talent and hard work that richly deserves any award that you're kind enough to bestow. When I was asked to speak tonight, I decided that my subject matter should be on a subject with foreign policy implications and not solely on financial services. So perhaps I could begin with a paradox. It's this. Just as more people than ever before in history are migrating to developed countries in search of work, so much of that work is beginning to move from developed to developing countries. And I believe that a major beneficiary of both these trends will be China. According to the World Migration Report, there are now 175 million migrants globally, about 1 person in 35 on this planet. Although I should say, people move one by one, family by family, and they often slip under the radar screen. Officially, there are 40,000 French people living in London. Actually, it's around 200,000. Why do people move? Well, I'm sure the French don't go to London for the food or the wine. I suspect they mainly go for tax and financial reasons. People have always migrated for the same reason, to find a better life and a safer life for themselves and their children. And this applies just as much to the Chinese PhDs as it does to the dispossessed refugees of sub-Saharan Africa. The growth in migration is both fueled and aided by other facets of globalization: improved transportation, better communications. Refugees can see their new world on CNN. There's also a smaller number of people with skills much in demand: research scientists, medical consultants, university professors, who are very mobile geographically. These highly prized people will choose to live where they see the best quality of life, which is why cities are going to have to get to grips with crime, dirt, transport, and poverty if they want to prosper. The effect of immigration to developed countries will be, depending on your personal perspective, beneficial, as it brings workers into countries with aging populations who need to fund their pensions, or negative, as wages in some countries, and therefore standards of living, are constrained by an ever more competitive global employment market. The effect on those states providing the mass emigrations will be salutary. Failing and failed states have a choice: stagnation and depopulation, or adjustment. In the long term, the majority will have to copy China, India, Mexico, or they will condemn their people to poverty. The other side of this paradox is the movement of jobs to developing countries. As the world's economies integrate further, for the first time ever, things that can be done more effectively in China and India, for example, will be done in China and India. At companies like HSBC, this process has already begun. We have processing centers in India and China that perform work that was previously done in the Western countries. We can perform our work more productively there to the benefit of both our clients and our shareholders. As for HSBC, so for many others. I read an estimate in Business Week magazine 2 weeks ago that said 3.3 million American service industry jobs could move offshore in the next 15 years. And that's $136 billion of wages. And if you think about it, this is no more than a logical extension in services of what the manufacturing industry has done. We should remember that this is good for consumers overall, although it may not be good for some of the people who are involved in producing domestically, but it is certainly good for developing countries. Consequently, the standards of living in Europe and America for people in some businesses may be constrained until at least the standards of living of non-rural China and India and other countries around the world are in closer proximity to those of the West. And with more than 1 billion Chinese people and 1 billion Indian people, there are labor markets that will not run out anytime soon. This movement of jobs will lead to increased incomes in developing countries, and it will unleash a new wave of spending power there as they build consumer markets. Much of that spending power is going to be in China and India as middle-class incomes move from $15,000 to perhaps $50,000 or $60,000 or whatever it might be. This implies that there should be massive growth potential in these markets on a scale that perhaps we don't appreciate right now. Clearly, it will only be a segment of the population that moves quickly up the income scale, but the absolute numbers are vast. There is also a shift in spending as people increase their incomes. Food and drink accounts for 50% of spending in developing countries and 19% in the developed countries. And this gives rise to so-called sweet spots in consumer markets when incomes reach between $3,000 and $10,000 a year and consumption of consumer goods increases rapidly. This is why China bought 1.1 million new cars last year compared to less than half that number 5 years before. Today, China is the world's largest market for mobile phones. By next year, it will be the world's largest market for digital cameras and the second largest for PCs. As jobs go to China, the result is a pricing pressure on other economies in the world, and we're already hearing about this from our clients in Asia. And for HSBC, it's determining what work gets done where and what people get paid. And we're doing more and more work in China and more in India, as I say, work that was previously done in the West. The logical response to this in developed markets is increased investment in human capital that allows you to move to and retain high value-added jobs. Although even here, the West will be competing with the 465,000 science and engineering degrees granted by Chinese universities in 2001. And it will be interesting to see how quickly China moves up the value chain. Of course, there are many jobs that are geographically fixed. For example, public sector jobs, entertainment, hospitals, hotels, tourism, even agriculture, and these will become ever more important in developed economies. But the fundamental conclusion is that we're in for a significant change in the employment market in economies around the world. Perhaps I could turn to China. It's easy to forget that today's status quo is by no means to be taken for granted. For instance, for around 90% of the last 2,000 years, China has been the world's largest economy. China has developed to what it is today from a civilization that dates back over 4,000 years. China has both a tradition of Buddhism, which promotes the growth of the individual, and of Confucianism, which places the well-being of the family and of society above any individual's needs. This ability to live with ambiguity is a trait which is often found in Asia, but less often in the West. This cultural and ideological richness enabled the Chinese nation to absorb foreign rulers while remaining Chinese, as with the Mongols in the 13th century and the Manchus in the mid-17th century. More recently, while the Cultural Revolution left its mark, China has met the challenge of rebuilding its economy by once again showing a remarkable ability to assimilate and to adapt ideas from outside, to develop socialism with Chinese characteristics. This resilience is nothing new. Indeed, China's continuity is what is startling. Sometimes the West does not pay enough attention to the underlying consistency in Chinese thought. In foreign policy, for example, since 1949, China has had just 6 foreign ministers. The United Kingdom has had 23. China has developed to what it is today from a civilization that dates back over 4,000 years. China's character is shaped by a largely homogeneous culture that emerged out of a geography that was essentially locked by mountains to the south and west, the desert to the north, and the oceans to the east, hence the name the Middle Kingdom. And in isolation, they developed an amazing civilization. When Marco Polo arrived in China a millennium ago, he found the greatest civilization in the world, the largest population, the world's first restaurants, the world's first printing presses, and paper money. The Chinese made steel 1,500 years before Europe. They have the dubious distinction of inventing taxation. The Chinese people have a deep sense of their culture and heritage. When I was in Singapore in the early 1960s, I used to watch illiterate people in the streets pay 5 cents to the storyteller who would tell them the history and the mythology of China, the stories of emperors, of heroes, of hubris, of failure, of victory. In fact, I would say that in my experience, the two countries with the greatest sense of nationalism and patriotism that I have seen are among the oldest and the youngest, China and the United States. The rude interruption to the huge sweep of Chinese history was the arrival of Europeans. Europeans with a history of practicing warfare and empire building. The changes wrought by this led to 200 years of relative instability and the adoption and adaptation of elements of a Western ideology, communism. In the Chinese people, there is a deep-rooted confidence in their own culture, their own civilization, and that in the long run, they will restore China to its rightful position in the world's pecking order. China, because of its size, has always been a, or the, major economy in the world. And when China starts to approach the per capita standard of the living of the West, we will see the most powerful economy ever. Perceptions of China in the West, by and large, have not kept up with reality. Anyone like me who goes there regularly can see the changes with their own eyes. I first went to China in 1972, in Mao's era, when the population lived on vouchers issued by the Communist Party. There was virtually no need for money. I was shadowed by an interpreter, and loudspeakers at the border denounced imperialism. Today, you can see Arnold Palmer-designed golf courses. You can buy all the world's top brands, Chanel in the Nanking Road in Shanghai, and you can travel through stunning new international airports. The West sees China in black and white, or maybe even red, as a communist country, a totalitarian state. But the Chinese leadership is experimenting with the evolution of the political and economic order. The leadership today is well aware that its mandate, as for the dynasties of the past, comes from the will of the Chinese people. There are no alternatives to reform in China. The only debate is about the pace of change. It is certainly an excellent sign that China is about to complete its first orderly transition of power from one generation of leaders to the next. Given the enormous challenges China faces in its transition from a rural to a more urban society, from a state-run to a private enterprise-based economy, and establishing the rule of law and contracts, and in common with many countries of eliminating corruption. You can clearly see the signs of progress politically and economically. In China, we should remember that one-party rule is not always undemocratic. Already, 800,000 Chinese villages directly elect their heads, and you cannot become village party secretary unless you've been elected village head first. And China's not averse to learning from the West. When President Jiang Zemin visited the United States during the Clinton administration, he asked to visit IBM. The immediate assumption was that he wanted to see Deep Blue, the supercomputer, or to visit their research laboratories. In fact, he wanted to meet Lou Gerstner and talk to some of his board members in order to learn about corporate governance and how you manage an international business in today's world. I've had first-hand experience of this thirst for knowledge. I'm a member of the Mayor of Shanghai's International Advisory Council, and I was asked to entertain the vice chairman of the top 4 banks in China, and they asked to meet me with a non-executive director of HSBC so that we could both explain the difference between an executive and a non-executive role and how we manage a business with 185,000 colleagues in 81 countries around the world and where half the profits are made when I'm asleep. We can now see theory being put into practice. This year, China is planning corporate governance legislation that limits people to 5 directorships, and it mandates 1 non-executive director must be a qualified accountant. And in Shenzhen, the economic powerhouse next to Hong Kong, reforms are being put in place to separate the powers of party and government from business activities and to develop the legislature in a conscious attempt to echo Western systems of corporate governance and a legal system that's compatible with a fully developed economy. During the process of planning these reforms, they studied models from the United Kingdom, Singapore, and Hong Kong. Incidentally, Shenzhen now has 300 companies run by Silicon Valley returnees, and 1,000 foreign-educated Chinese are moving there every year. People left China steadily during the past 200 years, but these emigrants have never lost the love of their country. The return of the overseas Chinese, I believe, will be one of the great migrations of the 21st century. And that is why I said at the beginning that China would benefit from both the trends I've talked about. The number of Taiwanese living in mainland China has grown from 300,000 to 500,000 in the past 2 years. While their political leaders still have many issues to resolve, 2.5% of Taiwan's population has voted with their feet and sought employment in China. And the 55 million overseas Chinese around the world are responsible for about 2/3 of China's foreign direct investment, which has been $200 billion over the past 20 years. The journey to China becoming a world power will not be entirely smooth, but the direction is inexorable, and the only judgment in my belief is how long it will take. For the West, engagement is the only sensible strategy, and I believe that any attempts to isolate China would be counterproductive. We stand on the threshold of the 21st century, and we can already see some of the dominant trends. People will move on an unprecedented scale. More and more people will choose where to live because of the quality of life they can obtain and their ability to improve their circumstances. There's a pressing need for the peoples of the OECD countries to find ways to share their standards of living with the developing world. Technology and communications will connect people around the world in a way that politics, which remains essentially domestic, will find hard to accommodate. The West is in for a sustained period of price pressure on any goods or services that can be produced in an emerging economy. This will be good for consumers, although it'll be tough for domestic producers. The mass consumer markets of tomorrow are in China and other developing economies like India, Mexico, and Brazil. Goldman Sachs estimates that developing markets will provide about half the growth in demand in the world economy over the next 30 years, those consumer sweet spots like China's cars. So we'll see the rise of China as a new, or they would say, a restored power. I'm excited by this prospect. I believe the West has a great opportunity to engage with the new China, and I always remember that the Chinese character for threat is the same as the one for opportunity. Thank you.